Thanks. I'm assuming everybody can see my slides. You'll have to tell me if you can't. Um, I want to start by saying that my interest in this have always been very much on the ground, right? I'm a religious educator and a media educator, and these fields have always been synthetic, or I like the term that got shared yesterday, transversal. Um, so I'm always, we're always in these spaces. My entry has to do with online discipleship and spiritual formation, and that is really trying to do that for a handbook is a labyrinthine task, right? Because sometimes these words denote explicit teaching that a faith community is doing, like words like catechesis or Christian education or discipling. And at other times, these words have more to do with kind of individual personal experiences, such as spiritual direction, faith formation, soul storying. And so, for the sake of brevity, and for the sake of this entry in particular, I've understood both discipleship and spiritual formation in this way, as referring to an ecology in which churches are intentionally seeking to make accessible the traditions of a religious community and to make manifest the intrinsic connection between traditions and transformation. And I should say, I'm not just thinking about Christian churches. I think this is true across religious communities. But both of these words, right, assume a relationship with a divine and a belonging within a specific community, and they carry a sense of process, of dynamic kind of ongoingness. And from that space in my entry, I'm trying to connect and share linkages and resources. So when I was thinking about a handbook, that's part of what I was thinking about. Now, we've already said this, I think, but digital technologies have been architects of attention, and now with generative AI are moving into being architects of attraction. I really liked this previous presentation about how generative AI works, and I think one of the affordances that we're living with and the challenges we're living with have to do with this way of creating this sense of relationship of attraction. So how are they doing this? Well, in part, through three significant dynamics that are shifting in digitality and digitally. And, people have been talking about this for years now. How we understand authority, the degree to which interpretation of what is authentic shapes understanding, and the ways in which we experience agency, personally, collectively, and in response to God's divine agency. And I think some of the discussion about creativity is pertinent here. Now, discipleship and spiritual formation, in whatever way you're going to use those words, have gone through a variety of very swift explorations in this era. They started with a kind of very early instrumentalism, like let's just throw preaching online because this will be a great megaphone. From there, it moved into concern with safe spaces. Could we create sort of Christian safe spaces? What would that mean? What would that look like? And then, of course, as the technology kept creeping into our practices, and as Heidi Campbell and others have shown, convergence starts to happen. So these are identity questions, right? And identity questions emerge with, of course, theological dynamics, right? What does it mean to be human? How do we describe a tradition that we are trying to make accessible? How much transformation is too much? Some of those are ethical questions. I think this is part of what is so challenging about being on the ground as a religious educator, because if you're trying to give people access to a tradition and at the same time make clear that the tradition is always in the process of transformation, how do you do that in all these fluid spaces? Now, I have found it very useful as I'm looking at different religious traditions to use this kind of notion, which originally came from math, of what a bounded set and a centered set, right? So in a bounded set, it's very clear what the boundaries are. You're either in them or you're out of them. And you could think about many ways in which religious traditions have tended to define their identities over and against something else, right? So you're part of this because you're not that. Now, I think that particular way of doing identity has been highly problematic for a whole host of reasons, but it's even more so now when context matters and context is collapsing around us. So the centered set piece, which says and said, okay, what's at the heart of what we're doing and how does that give us more porous boundaries, right? So what does it mean? Jewish educators in the US, for instance, like Michael Rosenak, have talked about what does it mean to create, to shape identity in a way that's loyal but open, right? Like, what does that look like? And I think that that's part of the challenge of what we're dealing with right now is we're trying to figure out what does it mean to create, to shape, to um, embed people in, to ignite curiosity about, to curate good materials for, to shape practices around a particular identity that has some substance and yet is porous, right? And that's, I think, something that involves power, involves a whole bunch of other issues. Okay, my response, for the most part, has been digital storytelling rooted in circle practices. And the thing about storytelling, digital storytelling, the way I understand it and the way it was originally rooted in community theater, is that it starts with embodied sharing of stories before you ever get to the digital part. And it's rooted in circle practices. And the thing about circle practices is that they rest in a different epistemology. Um, for most of us, at least in North America, they've been tended by Native communities, right? So that epistemology understands us as being all intimately relational, and the more diverse the knowers, the more robust the knowing, those kinds of things that are rooted in the practices of circles. I take that in a Trinitarian space because I'm a Roman Catholic teaching on a Lutheran faculty. And I talk about the ways in which, if we think about the Trinity as God creating, God sharing God's self into the world through Jesus the Christ, and God continuing to support belief through the Holy Spirit, if you think about that as a dynamic Trinitarian process, one of the problems with the ways in which we've done discipleship and to some extent even spiritual formation is that we've tended to feel like we have to enter this circle through the doorway of belief. Like we have to get the beliefs right. And this gets back to the, you know, bounded set versus centered set. Do we get the beliefs right? Then we can think about the other things. And part of what digitality has done has created spaces in which our creative agency is in some ways activated, right? And so one of the things I have found fascinating is how if you help people do storytelling and then, in circle-based processes, and then you help them take their narratives and put them into digital format and add images or music or whatever into short kinds of spaces, that slows people's storytelling down, actually, because any of you who've worked with digital tools know, even with AI, it doesn't always get it right, right? So you want to play with it and you're editing it and you're working with it. And once you've got something that you really like, it's inevitable that you want to share, right? So in this dynamic, in this Trinitarian dynamic, entering through creativity and through sharing leads to a deeper sense of belief and a more robust sense of belief. Okay, so to kind of go back to where I started, intentional forms of discipleship and spiritual formation, right? In that ecology about giving people access and helping them understand how traditions are always transforming, require recognition of authority, a clearly authentic set of practices, and an understanding of how one's agency is entangled with God's. And I think we've been talking about this a lot for the last several days. There have been all sorts of examples of ways in which people have played with video games, have played with apps. There's just all sorts of stuff that's out there that people are experimenting with. And part of what those of us who are religious educators, media educators are trying to figure out is how do we do that in a way that has robust substance to it and that shapes practices in ways that are actually life-giving. And so I speaking rapidly because I want to get to questions ultimately, but what is needed, and this is kind of where I end my entry in the handbook, is that what we need as we continue to do digital theology is we need theological articulations that help people to perceive the both and nature of what it is to be human in relation to transcendence, as well as the deep interdependence that flourishes in the midst of an embrace of all the diversity to be found in creation. And I was really moved by the session yesterday. I think it was Jeremy Kidwell and Alex Chow who were talking about creation and what it would mean to move not just from the Imago Dei notions, but into a larger sense of the relationality that's deeply embedded in creation and how that might change even our practices towards AI chatbots, right? Um, anyway, I think that's where, oh yeah, that's just my citation. So I wanted to end as quickly as I could so we could get to questions.